The first sign of him was the silence. Not the deep, snow-muffled quiet of the high pass, but the sudden, unnatural stillness of a forest that knows a predator walks within it. The birds went mute. The rustle of a pine marten in the undergrowth ceased. Signe, her hands chapped from splitting kindling, froze with the axe still raised. Her breath plumed, a white flag of surrender in the frigid air. Beside her, her dog Moss, a shaggy beast the color of wet earth, lifted his head from his paws, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Then came the scent, carried on the knife-edge wind, not just the clean bite of pine and frost, but something else. Something that curled in her memory like smoke from a long-dead fire. Cold iron, leather, and a wild, masculine scent that was purely, devastatingly him. A scent she had spent 5 years trying to forget, and a lifetime failing. "Jorik," she breathed, her voice a frozen whisper. "Inside, now." The boy, all of 5 years old with hair the color of winter wheat and eyes a startling, piercing gray, looked up from the small wooden wolf he was nudging through a drift of snow. He had his father's eyes. The thought was a shard of ice in her gut. "But Mama, the wolf is hunting." "The hunt is over." She did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. But a different tone entered it now, a low thrum of urgency that Jorik had learned to obey without question. He scrambled to his feet, dusting snow from his patched trousers, and scurried toward the low-lying stone and turf cottage that was the only home he had ever known. Signe lowered the axe, her knuckles white. She forced herself to take a slow, deliberate breath, though her lungs felt tight and brittle. She was a healer's apprentice, a woman who lived on the forgotten edge of the kingdom, mending broken bones and brewing tisanes for colic. She was nobody. But 5 years ago, for one stolen night at a midwinter festival, she had been somebody to the man who was now walking up the path to her door. He emerged from the dense stand of fir trees, not alone, but flanked by 2 men in dark cloaks, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords. But Signe barely saw them. Her gaze was fixed on the man in the center. Time had been both kind and cruel to him. Stellan. The name was a prayer she had forbidden herself. He was broader in the shoulder than she remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper, etched by burdens she could only imagine. The boyish prince was gone, replaced by a king whose presence was a weight, pressing down on the very air. His dark hair was longer, threaded with a few surprising strands of silver at the temples, and his jaw was shadowed with a beard that hadn't been there on the night she had traced it with a trembling finger. He stopped a dozen paces from her cottage. His gaze swept over the meager wood pile, the smoke curling from the chimney, the small, sturdy figure of the woman standing before him, with an axe held loosely in one hand. And then his eyes, those same startling gray eyes she saw every morning across her breakfast table, found hers. Recognition did not dawn in them. It ignited. A flicker of something hot and sharp that cut through the cold mask of his composure. He had not forgotten. The thought was both a terror and a strange, unwelcome relief. He took a step forward. Moss, who had never bitten a soul, bared his teeth and let out a vicious snarl. Stellan halted. He looked at the dog, then back at her. He didn't command her to restrain the animal. He simply waited, a king accustomed to the world arranging itself to his will, yet for the first time in 5 years, he seemed uncertain of his next move. Signe laid a hand on Moss's ruff. The dog's growl subsided to a low, unhappy rumble. "He won't bite," she said, the words tasting like rust in her mouth. unless I tell him to. It was a lie. Moss was a gentle soul, but it was the only weapon she had. Stellan's gaze flickered to the cottage door, which Jorik had left slightly ajar. A sliver of warmth and light spilled out, carrying the scent of stew and burning peat. He could not have seen the boy, not yet, but he knew. She could see it in the sudden tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He knew what he had come here to find. Signe, he said. Her name. He said it as if it were a physical thing, something he had been carrying for a very long time and had only just now set down. The sound of it on his tongue almost broke her. Almost. She had raised a king's son on boiled roots and scraps, had kept him warm with her own body heat through fevers, had sung him to sleep while her own heart was breaking. She would not shatter now. She lifted her chin, meeting the Alpha King's gaze without flinching. She had a son to protect. He did not command her. He did not storm her small, defensible world. He did the one thing she had not anticipated. He waited. Stellan, the Alpha King of the North, whose word could start wars and end dynasties, stood in the deepening twilight of her mountain hollow and simply waited for her permission to speak. His 2 guards, broad men with hard faces, stood back, their discomfort a palpable thing in the frozen air. They were warriors, not courtiers, and this silent, fraught negotiation was clearly beyond their ken. "We will make camp," Stellan said finally, his voice low and directed at his men, though his eyes never left Signe. "Downstream. Do not disturb the perimeter." One of the guards, a man with a thick braided beard, opened his mouth as if to protest the indignity of sleeping in the snow when a roof was so near, but a single, sharp look from his king silenced him. They retreated, their heavy boots crunching in the snow, leaving the 2 of them alone in the vast, listening quiet. The cottage door creaked open further. Jorik's small face appeared in the gap, his expression one of solemn curiosity. "Mama?" he whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the stillness. "Is that the wolf man from your stories?" Signe's heart seized. The stories she told were of the old kings, of men who could speak to the beasts and whose blood ran hot with the spirit of the wild. She had never used his name, had never described his face, but somehow the child knew. He saw the echo of himself in the stranger's face. Stellan's gaze dropped to the boy. The hard lines of his face did not soften, but something shifted in his posture. The rigid control eased, replaced by a profound, aching stillness. It was the look of a man starving who had just been shown a feast. "Go inside, Jorik," Signe said, her voice tight. "Stoke the fire." Jorik hesitated, his gray eyes moving from his mother's tense face to the tall, dark man who stood like a statue in the snow. Then, with a wisdom beyond his years, he nodded and retreated, closing the door with a soft click. "He is well," Stellan stated. It was not a question, it was a pronouncement, a marvel. "He is," Signe replied, her chin still high. "No thanks to you." A flicker of pain crossed his features, so quick she might have imagined it. "I looked," he said, the words rough, as if torn from his throat. "From the moment I knew you were gone, I looked. You were a prince, with 100 men at your command. I was a girl, with nothing but the clothes on my back. You did not look very hard." The bitterness was a poison she had swallowed for years, and a drop of it had finally spilled over. "I was followed," he said, his voice dropping even lower, forcing her to lean forward to hear. "Watched. Every move I made was scrutinized. I could not ask for you by name. I could not describe you. To do so would have been to put a target on your back. He took a half step closer, his hands held open at his sides, a gesture of peace. I sent men I trusted, quietly. They searched every village, every healer's enclave from the sea to the sunken mountains. They looked for a girl with hair like spun moonlight and eyes the color of moss after a rain. They looked for 5 years. She stared at him, her mind reeling. She wanted to call him a liar. It would be so much easier to believe he was a monster, a careless prince who had forgotten her the moment she'd left his bed. But the raw, unvarnished truth was there, in the bleakness of his gaze, the weariness of a long, fruitless hunt. "Why?" she whispered, the question she had asked herself 1,000 times in the lonely dark. "Why look at all?" "Because you took something that belonged to me," he said. His eyes flickered toward the cottage. The cold dread she had held at bay rushed back in, suffocating her. He was here to take him, to rip the heart from her chest and carry him back to a cold stone castle where he would be raised by strangers. Her hand tightened on the handle of the axe. It was a pitiful weapon against a king and his men, but it was all she had. "You will not have him," she said, the words a low, fierce growl that surprised even herself. Moss, sensing her shift in mood, began to growl again in sympathy. Stellan held up a hand, not to ward her off, but to stop her words. "I am not here to take him from you, Signe." His voice was raw with an emotion she couldn't name. "I am here to ask you to bring him home, both of you." He offered and waited. The words hung in the air between them, more shocking than any command. He was not taking, he was asking. He was giving her a choice she had never dreamed she would have, and the sheer, terrifying weight of it stole the breath from her lungs. She looked from his earnest, tired face to the warm light of her cottage, where the entire world she had built was sitting by the fire, waiting for his mother. The night was long. Signe did not sleep. She sat in her lone wooden chair, watching the steady rise and fall of Yorick's small chest as he slept in his cot. Moss lay at her feet, his head on her boots, occasionally letting out a low, sleepy whine. Outside, she was acutely aware of the camp Stellan had made. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it, a disturbance in the fabric of her solitude. A single campfire, its smoke a thin gray ribbon against the stars. She replayed his words. "I am here to ask you to bring him home, both of you." Home. What a strange and loaded word. This cottage, this harsh and beautiful mountain, was home. The capital, a place of stone and intrigue she had only ever heard about in whispers, was not. When the first pale light of dawn touched the peaks, there was a soft knock on her door. It was not the knock of a king. It was hesitant, respectful. She opened it to find him standing there, alone. He held out a small, covered basket. "Peace offering," he said. His voice was rough with sleep. She took the basket, her fingers brushing his. A jolt, like lightning, shot up her arm. She pulled back as if burned. Inside the basket lay a loaf of dark, rich bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and 3 perfect red apples. It was more luxury than she and Yorick had seen in a year. Her stomach rumbled in betrayal. "He should have proper food," Stellan said, his gaze fixed on a point over her shoulder. "A growing boy." "He has eaten every day of his life," she countered, though the words lacked their previous fire. The sight of the apples, so crisp and flawless, had disarmed her. "I have provided for him." "I know," he said, and the simple sincerity in his voice undid her more than any grand apology could have. "You have done what I could not. You have kept him safe." The cottage door, which she had left open, became a frame for the scene. Yorick, awake now, stood in the doorway, clutching his wooden wolf. He looked at the tall man, then at the basket in his mother's hands, his gray eyes wide with a child's directness. "Are you my father?" Yorick asked. The world stopped. The wind died in the trees. The smoke from Stellan's distant fire held its breath. Signe's heart hammered against her ribs. She had prepared for this question, had practiced gentle, evasive answers for years. "Your father was a brave man. Your father is watching from the stars." But she had never prepared for this. Stellan sank to one knee in the snow. It was a slow, deliberate movement, the flexion of a king unused to kneeling to anyone. He brought himself down to the boy's level, his fine, dark cloak pooling around him. He did not look at Signe for help. His entire world had narrowed to the small, serious face of his son. "Yes," Stellan said, his voice thick. "I am." Yorick took a hesitant step forward, his bare feet on the cold stone threshold. He studied Stellan's face, his gaze tracing the lines of his brow, the shape of his mouth. He reached out a small, chubby hand and laid it on Stellan's bearded cheek. "You're scratchy," Yorick declared. A sound escaped Stellan's lips, a choked-off laugh that was half a sob. He closed his eyes for a moment, pressing his face into the boy's small palm as if it were a benediction. When he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "I can shave," he offered, his voice unsteady. Yorick considered this. "No," he said finally. "I like it." He turned to his mother, his expression one of grave importance. "Mama, he can stay. I like him." And just like that, the decision was made, not by a king's decree or a mother's fear, but by the simple, unvarnished pronouncement of a 5-year-old boy. Signe looked at Stellan, still kneeling in the snow, a giant of a man brought low by a child's touch. He was not the monster of her fears. He was just a man, a father. And for the first time, she allowed a tiny, fragile seed of hope to take root in the frozen ground of her heart. Maybe home wasn't a place. Maybe it was a person. Or 3. Stellan did not press her. He did not rush her. He seemed to understand that her trust was a wild, timid thing that had to be coaxed, not captured. He and his men remained at their camp, a discreet distance away, but his presence and the changes it wrought were undeniable. Each morning a basket appeared on her doorstep, fresh bread, smoked fish, dried fruits. Luxuries that spoke of a world beyond subsistence. At first, Signe's pride bristled, but then she saw the way Yorick's eyes lit up at the sight of a pear, the way his cheeks were beginning to fill out, and she swallowed her pride along with the sweet, nourishing food. The king, it turned out, was surprisingly patient. He spent his days in quiet observation. He would watch from the edge of the woods as she went about her chores, chopping wood or gathering herbs. He never intruded. He just watched, his expression unreadable. But it was his interactions with Yorick that began to systematically dismantle her defenses. He did not know how to be with a child, it was obvious. He was stiff, formal, his movements awkward. But he tried. He would sit on a fallen log for hours, attempting to carve a block of wood for the boy. His first few attempts were clumsy, splintered things, but he persisted. His large, calloused hands, hands that had wielded a sword and signed royal decrees, painstakingly working the wood until he produced a surprisingly lifelike hawk, its wings outstretched. He offered it to Yorick without a word, his gaze averted, as if he were afraid of the boy's judgment. Yorick accepted the gift with a solemn nod. "It needs eyes," he announced. Stellan looked startled, then nodded. "Yes, it does." The next day, he returned with 2 tiny, polished river stones and, with immense concentration, set them into the carving. Signe watched these exchanges from a distance, her heart a confusing mix of emotions. She saw the longing in Stellan's face, the deep, hollow ache of a man trying to reclaim 5 lost years in a matter of days. She saw the easy, unconditional acceptance in her son. Yorick had never had a father, and he seemed to have decided that this large, quiet, sad-eyed man would do nicely. He would take Stellan's hand and lead him on hunts through the woods, pointing out squirrel tracks and badger dens with an air of great authority. Stellan would follow, his long legs adapting to the boy's shorter stride, listening with rapt attention. One afternoon, as a light snow began to fall, Stellan approached her as she was hanging washed linens on a line between 2 trees. The crisp, clean scent of the cold air clung to the damp fabric. "Oren says a storm is coming from the north," he said, referring to his bearded guard. "A bad one. You should not be out in it." "My roof has weathered worse," she said coolly, not looking at him. "The roof, perhaps, but the cottage is built into the hillside. A heavy snow could block your door, trap you." He paused. "My men can reinforce the walls, cut you a winter supply of wood." It was an offer of help, of protection, but all she heard was criticism, an indictment of her own meager preparations. "I have survived 5 winters here alone," she snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "I do not need your help." His face shuddered. "I know," he said quietly. He turned to leave, and a sudden, perverse impulse made her call after him. "Why did you come yourself?" she asked. "Why not just send your men to take him?" He stopped, his back to her. For a long moment, he was silent. "Because I had to see you," he said, his voice low and strained. "I had to ask you a question." He turned to face her, and the raw vulnerability in his eyes was a blow. "Why did you run?" The question she had always dreaded, the one she had no good answer for. "I was afraid," she whispered, the truth a small, pathetic thing. "Of me?" The hurt in his voice was genuine. "No," she said, shaking her head. "Not of you. Of them. The court. The whispers. I was a healer's apprentice from a nowhere village. What would they have done to me? To a child born out of wedlock to a prince? They would have called me a whore, a schemer. They would have taken him from me and hidden me away in some convent or worse. I ran to protect him." "You ran from me," he corrected, his voice flat. "You did not trust me to protect you." The accusation hit its mark, because it was true. She had seen the burdens he carried even then, the weight of his destiny. She had been a fleeting moment of solace for a prince, nothing more. How could she have asked him to defy his world for her? "What was I to you?" she asked, the question tearing from her. "A moment's warmth on a cold night? A girl whose name you couldn't even remember the next morning?" He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He stopped inches from her, so close she could feel the heat rolling off him, could see the storm gathering in his gray eyes. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take a corner of the damp linen sheet she was still clutching. His fingers were steady, his gaze unwavering. "Your name is Signe," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You had a smudge of flour on your cheek. You smelled of lavender and honey. You laughed when I told you I was a prince and said I had the hands of a stonemason. You told me you dreamed of seeing the ocean. I have forgotten nothing about that night, not a single thing." Each detail was a stone dropped into the quiet pool of her heart, the ripple spreading, disrupting everything. He remembered. He had carried the memory of her, just as she had carried the memory of him. And in that moment, under the falling snow, the carefully constructed walls around her heart began to crumble into dust. His confession hung in the air, a fragile, shimmering thing. Signe felt her own history reconfiguring around it. The narrative she had told herself for 5 years, that she was a fleeting, forgotten dalliance, was a lie. He had remembered. He had held the small, mundane details of their night together as treasures. The storm he had predicted arrived with a vengeance. The world dissolved into a howling vortex of wind and snow. Stellan's men, Oren and the other younger guard named Piet, worked with grim efficiency, banking snow against the cottage walls for insulation and piling firewood by her door until the stack reached the eaves. They moved with the economy of men used to hardship, their actions a stark contrast to their king's emotional turmoil. They were all forced inside the small cottage. The space, which had always felt cozy for two, was now crowded with the sheer masculine presence of the 3 men. Oren, the gruff one, seemed to take up the most space, his grumbling presence a constant source of low-level friction. Piet was young and quiet, his eyes full of a hero worship for his king that was almost painful to watch. And Stellan? Stellan was a quiet storm at the center of it all. He tried to make himself smaller, folding his long limbs into the cramped space, taking the worst seat by the drafty door. He was hyper-aware of her, of every move she made. If she reached for a log, his hand was there first. If she shivered, he would shift his body to block a draft. It was a language of care spoken entirely through action, and she found herself, despite her best efforts, learning to read it. Jorik, oblivious to the adult tension swirling around him, was in heaven. He had a captive audience. He clambered onto Oren's lap, demanding stories. The big guard, who looked as if he wrestled bears for sport, turned a surprising shade of red and mumbled something about not being a skald. "Tell him about the ice worm of the glacier's tooth," Stellan suggested, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time. Oren shot his king a look of profound betrayal, but, with a long-suffering sigh, began a low, rumbling tale. Jorik listened, enraptured. Later, as the stew bubbled over the fire, filling the cottage with its savory scent, Signe found herself working alongside Stellan. He was peeling potatoes with a dagger, a task he was clearly unsuited for, his movements clumsy but determined. "Your hands are not made for this work," she observed quietly. "No," he agreed, not looking up from his fumbling efforts. "They are made for holding a sword, or a scepter." He paused, setting down a mangled potato. "I would rather they held this." The quiet sincerity of the statement stole her breath. This powerful man, this alpha king, was confessing a weariness for the very things that defined him. He was tired of being a king. He wanted to be a man, peeling potatoes in a warm cottage with his family. "Brand will not allow it," he said suddenly, his voice low. "Brand?" "My cousin." The name was spoken with a cold, flat finality. My father's brother's son. He has been a thorn in my side since we were boys. He believes the throne should have been his. He finally looked at her, his gray eyes dark with a trouble that had nothing to do with the storm outside. When she died giving birth to a stillborn daughter, Bran began to whisper that the gods had found me wanting, that my line was cursed. For years I had no heir. My position was precarious. So there had been another, a wife, a mate. A pang of something sharp and unwelcome, something that felt horribly like jealousy, shot through her. She pushed it down. It was ancient history. But I don't understand, she said. If you needed an heir so badly, why search in secret? Why not declare that you had a son? Because Bran's whispers had become shouts, he explained, his voice grim. He had convinced half the council that I was unstable, lost in grief. If I had announced I was searching for a son from a festival tryst 5 years prior, they would have locked me in a tower. Brand would have been named regent. He would have found you. And he would not have knelt in the snow and asked for your permission. The implication was clear and cold. Brand would have taken Jorek and eliminated Signe as an inconvenient loose end. The fear she had felt upon his arrival was nothing compared to the icy dread that now filled her. The danger wasn't from Stellan. It had never been from Stellan. The danger was from a world she didn't know, a cruel cousin with ambition and a court full of vipers. Stellan's secrecy, his 5-year search, had not been a sign of his indifference. It had been his shield, protecting them from a threat she never even knew existed. She had thought she was hiding her son from his father, but all along, his father had been hiding them from the world. The storm raged for 2 days. Confined in the small space, a strange domesticity began to take hold. Oren's initial gruffness softened as he discovered Jorek found his beard an excellent place to hide small toys. Piet, the young guard, proved to have a surprisingly beautiful singing voice, and he taught Jorek the solemn, sad ballads of the northern armies. And Stellan simply was, a constant, quiet presence. He chopped wood, hauled water from the well before it could freeze over, and repaired the latch on her pantry door. He moved through the small routines of her life as if he had always belonged there. On the second night, after Jorek had fallen asleep in his cot, his hand clutching the hawk Stellan had carved, the adults sat in the flickering firelight. Oren and Piet were near the door, a silent, watchful presence. Signe was mending a tear in one of Jorek's shirts, her needle moving in a steady, practiced rhythm. Stellan sat across from her, watching her hands. My men should have found you within a year, he said, breaking the comfortable silence. My instructions were clear. A healer's apprentice, a small village, near the midwinter festival route. But you had vanished. I didn't stay in the village, she said, not looking up from her sewing. The healer I worked for, Marta, she was old. She knew the ways of the world. When I told her I was with child, and whose child it likely was, she did not judge. She packed me a bag, gave me all her silver, and told me to run to the high places, where the king's reach was short and life was hard. Men with soft hands don't climb mountains, she said. She was a wise woman, Stellan murmured. I owe her a debt. She is dead, Signe said, the words stark and bare. The winter before last. I went down to the village to trade herbs and learned she had passed. She finally looked at him, her eyes clear and direct. For 5 years, I believed I was running from you. I built a life on that fear. And now you tell me you were the one thing standing between us and a true monster. She took a shaky breath. It is a difficult thing to unlearn. Then let me teach you a new lesson, he said, his voice a low, earnest plea. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze intense. Trust me, Signe. Let me protect you. Let me protect him. Bran's power grows with every passing day he can claim I am without an heir. We cannot stay here. It is no longer safe. The truth of his words settled over her like a shroud. Her mountain refuge was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. The world she had run from had finally found her, and it was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Before she could answer, there was a frantic pounding on the door. Oren was on his feet in an instant, his sword drawn. Piet moved to stand in front of her and the sleeping Jorik. "Who goes there?" Oren boomed. A weak voice answered, thin and reedy against the howl of the wind. "A message. For the king." Stellan was at the door in a heartbeat. He drew the bolt and pulled it open, admitting a swirl of snow and a small, half-frozen man wrapped in furs. The messenger stumbled inside and collapsed on the floor, his face blue with cold. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across the tunic on his thigh. An arrow wound. "Brand?" Stellan asked, his voice like stone. The messenger nodded, his teeth chattering. "He has named you Oathbreaker, declared you unfit. He has seized the capital in the name of the council. He claims you abandoned the kingdom. He has patrols on all the main roads looking for you." The man coughed, a racking sound. They say he is looking for a witch and her bastard son." The words hung in the air, venomous and cold. Witch. Bastard. The very slurs she had run from had found her. Stellan's face was a mask of cold fury. He knelt by the messenger, pressing a hand to the man's wound. He looked up at Signe, and in his eyes she saw not a king, but a wolf backed into a corner, a predator ready to do anything to protect his own. "The time for hiding is over," he said, his voice a low growl. "We ride for the capital. We ride home." And in the way he said it, she knew he was no longer asking. The journey was a descent into a colder, harder world. They left the cottage at first light, the storm having passed, leaving behind a world pristine and white, deceptively beautiful. Signe took one last look at the small turf house, the place where she had forged a life from nothing. It looked so small, so fragile. She felt a pang of grief for the simple, hard life she was leaving behind, even as a current of fear and anticipation pulled her forward. They traveled not as a royal retinue, but as fugitives. Stellan, Oren, and Piet had shed their fine cloaks for the rough, patched furs of common travelers. Signe and Jorik were bundled in layers of wool and leather, their faces obscured by hoods. They took the high, forgotten paths, the goat tracks and smugglers' routes that Stellan seemed to know as well as the lines on his own hand. Jorik, who had never been more than a day's walk from his own home, was wide-eyed with wonder and exhaustion. For the first few days, he rode before Signe on a sturdy mountain pony, but as they descended into the thicker, snow-laden forests of the lowlands, his small body grew tired. It was Oren, the gruff guard, who eventually swept the boy up and settled him in front of his own saddle. Signe watched, astonished, as the fierce warrior gently wrapped his own cloak around Jorik, murmuring reassurances as the boy's head began to nod. Stellan led them, a silent, relentless force at the head of their small procession. He seemed to survive on no sleep and little food, his senses constantly alert. He would stop them with a raised hand, listening to the wind, his head cocked. Once they spent a full day hidden in a rocky crevice, silent and still, as a patrol of Bran's men, their banners stark against the snow, passed by on the road below. Signe watched them, her heart pounding, her hand resting protectively on George's back as he slept in Oren's arms. The nights were the hardest. They huddled together for warmth around small, smokeless fires in hidden dells. The easy domesticity of the cottage was gone, replaced by a tense, wary camaraderie. But it was in these quiet, stolen moments that the space between Signe and Stellan began to shrink. One evening, as they shared a meager meal of dried meat and hardtack, he noticed her rubbing her hands together, her gloves worn thin at the fingertips. Without a word, he took off his own thick, fur-lined gloves and pushed them into her hands. "No," she protested. "Your hands—" "My hands are accustomed to the cold," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Yours are not." He closed her fingers over the warm leather. His touch was brief, impersonal, yet it sent a wave of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. Another night, George woke whimpering from a bad dream. Before Signe could even move, Stellan was there, kneeling by the boy's makeshift bed of pine boughs. He didn't speak. He simply laid a large, steady hand on the boy's chest until his breathing evened out, and he drifted back to sleep. He remained there for a long time, a dark, protective shadow guarding his son's dreams. The confession, when it came, was as quiet and unexpected as the fall of a single leaf in a silent forest. They had been forced to take shelter from a sudden freezing rain in a shallow cave behind a frozen waterfall. The air was damp and bone-chilling. Jorik was asleep, tucked between a sleeping moss and a snoring Oren. Piet stood watch at the mouth of the cave. Signe was staring into the heart of their small fire, her thoughts a tangled mess. Stellan sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat from his body, but not touching. "I remembered you," he said, his voice so low it was almost lost in the hiss of the fire. She turned to look at him. His face was half in shadow, his gray eyes fixed on the flames. "I told myself it was a dream," he continued, his voice rough with remembered pain. "A fever dream from the wine and the pressure and the endless drone of my father's counsel. A girl with moonbeam hair and a healer's hands. It felt too good to be real, so I let it be a dream." He fell silent, and Signe held her breath, knowing this was a truth he had never spoken aloud before. When the festival ended and I returned to the capital, the dream wouldn't leave me. I started to wonder. I sent a man back to the village, a trusted friend. I told him to look for a girl who smelled of lavender. He came back a week later. He said you were real, and you were gone. He finally turned to look at her, and the desolation in his eyes was a physical blow. "I nearly tore the world apart looking for you, Signe. Not because of an heir, not because of my duty, but because the one real, perfect thing I had ever touched had vanished, and I didn't know if I had driven you away or if something terrible had happened. The not knowing, it was a poison. For 5 years it has been eating me alive." This was his confession that costs. Not an admission of love, but something far more profound. An admission of need, of a wound that had never healed. He had not been a careless prince. He had been a haunted man. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and laid her hand on his arm. The muscles beneath his leather tunic were bunched and tight. "I am here now," she whispered. It was all she could offer. It was everything. He turned his arm, capturing her hand in his. His grip was firm, desperate. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his beard scratching her skin. He closed his eyes, his forehead resting against their joined hands. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. In the flickering firelight of the cave, surrounded by enemies and uncertainty, a king and a healer finally found their way back to each other. The capital, when they reached it, was a city holding its breath. The usual boisterous energy of the markets was gone, replaced by a sullen, watchful quiet. Banners bearing Bran's sigil, a snarling black wolf against a field of red, hung from the ramparts of the gray keep, a stark and brutalist statement. Soldiers in Bran's livery patrolled the streets in pairs, their eyes cold and suspicious. They did not enter through the main gate. Stellan led them through the city's underbelly, through a series of dark, dripping sewer tunnels that smelled of refuse and despair. "I played in these tunnels as a boy," he murmured to Signe, his voice echoing in the darkness. "My cousin Brand was always afraid of the dark." The comment was casual, but it was a piece of a puzzle. Stellan knew the secret ways, the hidden paths. Brand knew only the main roads, the corridors of power. They emerged through a grate in the floor of a deserted bakery, the air thick with the scent of cold ashes and stale bread. An old woman with eyes as sharp and bright as a magpie's was waiting for them. "Marta's sister," Stellan explained in a whisper. A part of a network of loyalists so deeply hidden that even Brand spies had overlooked them. The kitchen staff, the stable hands, the laundresses, the invisible people who saw and heard everything. Here, Signe's power began to reverse. In the wilderness, she had been dependent on Stellan's strength and knowledge. Here, in this world of whispers and secrets, her own skills came to the fore. She was a healer. She knew how to listen, how to observe, how to move without being noticed. While Stellan and Oren met with grim-faced loyalist guards in shadowed back rooms, Signe moved through the kitchens and infirmaries of the keep's lower levels. She treated a cook's burned hand and learned that Brand ate alone, his food tasted by 3 separate people. She brewed a tisane for a laundress's headache and heard that the queen's old chambers, Stellan's first wife's rooms, had been stripped bare, every trace of her memory erased. Brand was not just seizing power, he was trying to rewrite history. Her most important discovery came from a young stable boy who was hiding a sick hound. The boy was terrified Brand's kennel master would put the dog down. Signe, seeing the boy's distress, treated the animal's infected paw. As she worked, the boy talked. He told her about the new war horses Brand had brought in, about the secret delivery of siege equipment in the dead of night, and he told her about the old northern gate, the one sealed since the last war, whose winch mechanism was rusted and supposedly broken. The boy, however, had spent a lonely winter greasing the gears with pig fat just to have a secret way to sneak out. The gate worked. That night, in their cramped hiding place, she presented her findings. The men listened, their expressions of surprise turning to respect. "The northern gate," Stellan mused, tracing a map on the dusty table. "It opens onto the old quarter. The guilds are there. They were loyal to my father. Brand has been bleeding them with taxes to pay for his new soldiers," Signe added, remembering the cook's bitter complaints. "They are unhappy." A plan began to form. Not a frontal assault, but something more subtle. A plan that relied not on brute force, but on timing, leverage, and the element of surprise. Stellan would use the northern gate to bring in a small force of loyalist guardsmen who had been waiting in the hills. They would secure the guilds, who would then rise up, creating a distraction. In the ensuing chaos, Stellan, with Orin and Pete, would make for the throne room. "And me?" Signe asked. "What about Jorik and me?" Stellan looked at her, his face grim in the lantern light. "I want you and the boy to go back through the tunnels. The baker's wife will take you north, to safety." "No," Signe said, her voice quiet but firm. The men all looked at her. "You are going to walk into that throne room and confront a man who has tried to murder you and your son. You will have your swords, but your greatest weapon is the one thing Bran thinks does not exist: your heir." She took a breath. "We will be with you." Stellan started to protest, his face a mask of fear for their safety. "You said you wanted me to trust you," she said, meeting his gaze. "Now you must trust me. Jorik is the proof of your legacy, but I am the proof of your truth. Let Bran call me a witch. Let him call my son a bastard. The people will see a king standing with his family, and they will see a usurper standing alone." There was a long silence. Orin looked from his king to this small, determined woman, and a slow grin spread across his bearded face. "The lad's mother has a warrior's heart, Your Majesty." Stellan looked at Signe, at the fierce, unwavering strength in her moss-green eyes. He saw not the timid girl he had met at a festival, nor the frightened mother he had found in the mountains. He saw a queen. "So be it," he said, his voice filled with a reluctant awe. "We face him together." The throne room was a cavern of tension. Bran sat on the high granite throne, a sliver of polished stone and dark iron that seemed to swallow him. He was a smaller man than Stellan, slighter of build, with a narrow, intelligent face that was currently twisted with smug satisfaction. He had arrayed the council lords before him, a captive audience to his triumph. The great doors at the end of the hall crashed open. Every head turned. Stellan stood there, framed by the doorway. He was not dressed for battle, but in a simple, dark tunic, the clothes of a king at rest, not at war. At his side stood Orin and Piet, their hands on their swords, their faces grim. But it was not the sight of the king that caused the collective gasp that echoed through the hall. It was the woman at his other side, her head held high, and the small boy who clung to her hand. "Cousin," Stellan said, his voice calm and carrying in the sudden silence, "I believe you are sitting in my chair." Bran's face went from smug to thunderous. "Seize him!" he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger. "He is an oathbreaker, a madman who abandoned his kingdom!" The guards in Bran's livery hesitated. They looked from the furious man on the throne to the calm, powerful presence of the king who had returned. This was Stellan, the wolf of the north, the man who had led them in battle. Doubt was a seed, and it had been planted. "I have not abandoned my kingdom," Stellan said, taking a step forward. Signe moved with him, a mirror of his resolve. "I have been securing its future." His gaze swept over the assembled lords. "Brand has told you I am without an heir, that my line is cursed and finished. He lies." He gestured to Jorik. The boy, overwhelmed by the staring faces and the vastness of the room, shrank behind Signe's legs. Brand let out a cruel laugh. "An heir? That? A mountain witch's bastard whelp? You would disgrace your father's throne with this fiction?" He spat on the floor. "She has ensorcelled you, cousin. A simple spell for a simple mind." "Her name is Signe." Stellan's voice was dangerously low. "She is the mother of my son, and she will be my queen." A murmur went through the crowd. This was more than a political move. This was a declaration. "I will not stand here and allow this farce," Brand snarled. He drew a small, ornate dagger from his belt. "This woman is a cancer on the kingdom. I will cut her out myself." He lunged, not at Stellan, but at Signe. It was a coward's move, fast and vicious. Oren and Piet moved to intercept, but Signe was faster. She did not scream or flee. She reacted as a healer. As Brand's arm came up, she saw the faint, bluish tint to his fingernails, the slight tremor in his hand, the sheen of sweat on his brow despite the chill in the hall. She had seen these symptoms before, in tinkers who worked with tainted mercury. Instead of backing away, she stepped forward, grabbing his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "The tremors," she said, her voice clear and ringing, not with fear, but with clinical certainty. "The paranoia, the rages. It's the silver gilding poison, isn't it? The one you used on your own father to hasten his end." Brand froze, his eyes wide with shock and horror. She had spoken a truth that no one was ever meant to know. His father, the old king's brother, had died of a wasting sickness years ago. "You're mad," he hissed, trying to pull his arm away. "Am I?" Signe held his wrist fast. "Show them your teeth, Lord Brand. Show the council the black line along your gums. You have been tasting your own poisons for so long, you have started to succumb to them yourself." The lords leaned forward, their faces a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension. Brand, in his panic, yanked his arm back, stumbling. His mask of control shattered, revealing the terrified, cornered animal beneath. He turned his wild eyes on Stellan. "This is all your fault," he screamed, and charged, the dagger held high. This time, Stellan was ready. He did not draw his sword. He met Brand's charge with his body, deflecting the dagger with his forearm. There was a grunt of pain, a flash of steel, and Brand was on the floor, the dagger clattering across the stone. Stellan stood over him, his arm bleeding freely, but his stance was unbroken. The throne room was utterly silent. Then a small voice piped up. "Papa, you're bleeding." Yorick, who had finally peeked out from behind his mother, pointed a small finger at Stellan's arm. Stellan looked down at the boy, then at his bleeding arm, and a slow, weary smile touched his lips. He walked back to Signe and Yorick, ignoring the fallen Brand, ignoring the stunned council. He knelt before his son, just as he had knelt in the snow. "It is only a scratch," he said gently. "Your mother will fix it. She fixes everything." He looked up at Signe, his eyes full of love, gratitude, and a profound, bone-deep relief. The battle had been won, not with an army, but with the truth, not with a sword, but with a healer's knowledge and a mother's courage. The kingdom had not been saved by its king alone. It had been saved by its family. The first snow of the next winter fell on a kingdom at peace. It dusted the ramparts of the gray keep, which no longer felt like a prison, but a home. In a private chamber, far from the throne room, a fire crackled in a great stone hearth. The room was warm, filled with the scent of beeswax and drying herbs. Stellan sat on a thick bearskin rug before the fire, his back against a cushioned chair. He was not mending a kingdom or signing decrees. He was painstakingly reattaching the wing to a small, carved hawk. His tongue was poked out in concentration, a habit Yorick had mercilessly pointed out was one they both shared. The scar on his forearm, a thin white line, was a faint reminder of the day everything changed. Signe watched him from the chair he leaned against, her fingers idly carding through his dark, clean hair. It was still threaded with silver, but the deep lines of weariness around his eyes had softened. He was still a king, but here, in this room, he was simply Stellan, her husband. Yorick was asleep in a bed that was far too large for him, his small form a gentle mound under a pile of furs. His wooden wolf stood guard on his bedside table, next to the hawk, which was now missing a wing. Moss, the shaggy dog who had been the first to recognize a threat and the first to accept a friend, was sprawled at the foot of the bed, his tail twitching in a dream. "He will be angry if you fix it for him," Signe murmured, her voice a low, contented hum. "He said he wanted to learn to use the glue himself." "I am not fixing it," Stellan replied, not looking up from his delicate work. "I am merely preparing the surfaces. It is a king's prerogative to prepare the way for his son." He held up the wing, inspecting his work. "Besides, the glue was made from boiled hooves. It is a foul-smelling business, not fit for a prince." "A prince who spent his morning making mud pies in the kitchen garden," she reminded him gently. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. "He has a fine sense of the earth, like his mother." He set the hawk and its wing down carefully and leaned his head back against her legs. He was a large, powerful man, the alpha king of the north, and yet he fit against her as if he were made for it. He took her hand, the one that was not in his hair, and brought it to his lips. He did not kiss it. He simply held it against his cheek, his beard soft against her palm. "I was thinking of the cottage today," he said quietly. "Were you?" "I was thinking of the way the light came through the one window in the morning, how it made dust motes dance in the air." He turned his head, his gray eyes finding hers. "For 5 years, my world was stone and shadow. I had forgotten what sunlight looked like." She knew what he meant. Her world had been snow and silence, a life of survival. She had forgotten what it felt like to be truly warm. "Orin is complaining again," she said, changing the subject, her heart too full. "He says the castle guards are soft and that young Piet is spending too much time composing ballads about your queen with eyes of moss." Stellan smiled. "Let him complain. A grumbling Orin is a happy Orin." He grew serious again, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "Are you happy here, Signe?" The question was soft, tinged with the old insecurity, the fear that this was all a fragile dream he had trapped her in. She looked around the warm, peaceful room, at the sleeping boy who was her heart, at the loyal dog, at the king who knelt before the fire to mend a child's toy. This life of stone and silk and responsibility was a world away from her mountain. But home, she had learned, was not a place on a map. She leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to the crown of his head. "I am where I belong," she whispered. It was the truest thing she had ever said. He closed his eyes, a king at rest, a man who had searched the world for his future and found it had been waiting for him all along. He was home. They all were.